How in the world is it already the end of January 2026? So the end of 2025 market stats finally came out, the overall synopsis from the Board of Realtors. I want to go over that with you today, kind of tell you a little bit about what happened in January so far, and maybe this is the groundwork for the year that we're going to see in 2026. So please stay tuned. If I were to come up with one word that wraps the 2025 market, I think it would be the word resilient. So, agents, especially, sellers in particular, buyers having the leg up and having more options and kind of a more normal market. But I think resiliency is the name of the 2025 market. Agents, if you're still around, kudos to you. The agents who started in 2020, it's a vastly 180-degree different market, right? So if you're still around, congrats to you. I would say yes, resilient, and because it was, I guess, I know a lot of people don't like the word correction, but it was somewhat of a correction year, with the first half being kind of slow and weird and just kind of waiting for the phone to ring a little bit despite all of our efforts. And then the second half kind of had an upswing. A lot of the people talking about the market and looking back at it and hearing experts like Ricky Carruth, Lawrence Yun, and other real estate experts, Dave Ramsey. I like to listen to a lot of different minds and podcasts and kind of formulate my own opinion. But the consensus seems to be like summer of last year was sort of like the bottom, maybe August. Time will always tell, right? And we can't really predict, but overall, prices kind of have adjusted downward since COVID, of course. So last year, about 5 to 6% on the downward as far as values. And remember, and this is what I always tell people too, like the real estate game, like the stock market, should be looked at as a long game, okay? A 5 to 10-year plan. So depending on where you are, there are very niche markets where you can get away with much shorter turnover and much higher return. But generally speaking, obviously it's hyper local, but go into it with a long-term mentality. So if you're buying a home to live in, you have to live somewhere, okay? And, build memories there and things like that. And if it's a investment property, you're going to have the write-offs and the income and all that. But again, long-term mentality. So let's dive into the stats, guys. I like to look at Sarasota County single-family homes as the tried and true gauge to the marketplace, because condos, townhomes, villas, they are always more volatile. So we like to look at single-family homes as the most honest gauge of, or the health, I guess, of the marketplace. So let's see where we're at. So Sarasota County, year over year, comparing 2025 to 2024, sales were actually up 17.7%, again, for Sarasota single family homes. Now, contrast that to Manatee County. Manatee County, for the same properties, single family homes were actually down. The sales were down 5.6%. What a difference. That is just really interesting. Also, the average days on market is 99 days. That is generally, when you look back historically, kind of a normal market. Even 6 months to sell a property is somewhat normal. 99 days, I would argue, is rather quick. I know that doesn't feel quick to a seller, but I'm seeing some interesting things happen as well while my brain is on this kind of like pathway here. I have had sellers who are actively listed with other realtors actually reach out to me privately. Now, if you think about that just from a general sense, like, do you think that does the seller a favor? In my eyes, it does not. It makes the seller look desperate. And this particular seller reached out to me. I looked him up. If he wasn't listed, I would have called him and things like that, try to get the listing and try to get it sold for him. But he was actively listed, offering me a 4.5% commission plus $1,000 bonus. I did respond out of courtesy, and I just said, like, listen, your agent so-and-so is probably doing everything they can. The home has only been on the market 32 days. You got to give it a chance. And it was short and sweet, but I screenshotted it and I sent it to his realtor so that he knew. And that was the end of the communication. But 32 days in a market that's saying 99, I think sellers need to be a little bit patient, understand that agents are working in the same market as them, and that we don't get paid until we sell your house. So nobody gets paid. The seller doesn't get paid. All the vendors that would be involved, title, attorney, and so on, they don't get paid. So we have an incentive to sell your house. And when you're overpricing it, obviously that doesn't help, right? I've got other videos in my playlist. I've got a recent video actually talking about why overpricing in 2026 will backfire. So take a look at that video if you're interested. The second example that comes to mind, and this isn't necessarily related to market stats, but an agent friend of mine has a listing, and he had a showing, and the buyer's agent called within a day or two and said, hey, my buyer is going to make an offer. Well, this other agent, the listing agent, said, oh, well, I'm putting it under contract. We just negotiated a deal. I just haven't changed it to pending in the MLS yet. And that was that. Well, then another day or two later, the agent who had previously called again and said, oh, is the buyer so-and-so? And he said, yes. The buyer put it under contract with a different realtor, which, okay, upon further investigation, the initial agent who called had not had a signed buyer broker agreement or showing agreement. And it turned out that agent's best friend had the son as the buyer. So they trusted the buyer to work with them, but they did not have a form, an agreement signed, either a showing agreement or a buyer broker agreement signed with that agent. She trusted that the buyer would just go with her. Well, the buyers don't know. Some of these buyers don't know that these are the new rules. These are the new rules. Okay. I've done many videos about it. When this was all coming out, the National Association of Realtors settlement created new rules and regulations across the country. This is not just a Florida thing. This is actually not a new thing. Buyers' agreements have always been around. It's just now required. So unless you're going to an open house, a buyer, if they want to schedule a tour, by the way, schedule a tour with a realtor, whether it's the listing agent or any other realtor, must sign a showing agreement or a buyer broker agreement. And so that's a really hard lesson for that realtor, and I've gotten calls too on my listings, and I tell them, like, I'm happy to show it. We have to have a showing agreement in advance. I don't pressure them into doing a more binding, like, buyer broker agreement, which would encompass other properties or any property in my market. To be fair to the buyer that just called me on my listing, I would just suggest, a showing agreement. But this is required, and I want the public to understand that. We cannot just go and open doors like that anymore, barring you walking into an open house. Okay, so now that we covered that, going back to the stats like I always do. So the two numbers, notably, like I mentioned, that are down are the median price, down 6%. We're at a median $474,700 median price for a single family home in Sarasota County. And then the average price was down 5%. So I mentioned earlier 5 and 6%, which is, again, still kind of, a correction here. Average price being $682,999. Now, the average price, because we've had so many skews way up in our market, especially, with new construction, I would say the median price is a little bit more of a good gauge in terms of values here, because the high end kind of skews the prices. What else can I tell you here? So cash is up just slightly, 3%. I wonder if we do see a couple more adjustments on the interest rate, if that will affect cash sales or not. But remember, we're in a snowbird community, so we do see a tremendous amount of cash sales anyway. These are second homes, a lot of them. And what else? The other thing, here's another fact that I like to look at, which is we covered that. The percentage of sale price to listing price year over year was, like, this time last year was 94.4%, and we kind of ended the year at 93%. So in other words, when you're listing your property and selling it, you're going to have more of a gap between where it actually ends and where you started from the last listed price. This is not from the original listing price. So if you started at $1 million, you eventually got it down to 900, and that's where the sale price comes in. It's based off of that last listed, not the original price. So the gap between asking and selling is getting larger. So stats don't lie. But here's one stat I do like. The months of supply has gone down. So it was 5.5 at the end of 2024. And at the end of 2025, it went down quite a bit to 4.7. So that 4.7 months of inventory is actually more of a buyer's market. I know that kind of it doesn't feel like that, but technically that's more, technically that's more of a seller's market. I got it backwards. So between 5 and 6 months is like an equal buyer seller market. That means it'll take about 5 to 6 months to sell off all the inventory. So I think that now that we kind of had a strange 2025, it kind of set the tone for 2026 that, properties are taking longer. You might have to have a price adjustment or two. You might be priced right, week one, but like your neighbor might undercut you, and now that's the market, and that's going to go pending first potentially. So again, I can't say it enough, but having a hyper local realtor who knows your property, who knows the streets, the views, the upgrades, the floor plans, like how much does a dock cost? How much does it cost to repair a seawall? How much this, that, the other, knowing and understanding the markets and having talked to a lot of these vendors over the years is really beneficial when you're negotiating, when you're going through inspections, and helping a client maneuver through that, whether you're a buyer or a seller. So I would love nothing more than to have you call me to consult with you on what your needs are, whether you're a buyer or a seller, or maybe you will be in the future, or maybe you have a referral and you have a friend that has some real estate needs. So, and by the way, if you haven't subscribed, click the subscribe button, and thank you, and comment and share. I love that. But you can call me anytime, 941-544-7690.